You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for the top wines and spirits of the world at vintmarketplace.com. As always, I'm joined by Billy Galanko, who is going to have to carry us a bit this episode because I'm talking with a mouthful of, well, not a mouthful of anything, but my mouth is numb. It's just at the dentist, and we didn't plan this properly.
Oh, you sound great. You sound great. I'm really excited. I think everybody got a good tease last week from our 5 Questions with a Winemaker episode with Stephen and Prue Henschke, but it was really fun to talk with those two legends, and we have our full interview with them this episode. And we also got a couple of bottles generously gifted to us from them that we're also going to talk about a little bit here before we jump into the interview. So that was exciting, and I came off a weekend of drinking a lot of delicious wine as well. And I think you did also.
That's right, yeah. Was able to try the Henschke, obviously, from very generous to gift them. And I actually had a bottle of Penfold Saint Henri open at the same time, which I might have mentioned on previous episodes that I just don't drink a lot of Australian wine. So the fact that I had those 2 bottles open at once was a treat and was kind of a cool comparison in the subtle ways that you could compare them. I know they're different wines, but yeah. And then some Chenin Blanc this weekend. Yeah, Loire, super good. The wife was not about it, but I was guzzling it. So
nice. Where was it from in the Loire?
Chinon. I can't remember exactly where. I don't even recall where I got it, actually. I think I bought it when I was back in Richmond, so it's been in my cellar a couple years.
Well, Chinon's a place, so they're better known for their Cabernet Franc, but it's possible you just had a appellated Chinon. That's cool.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Nice. Yeah, from the Vint Marketplace, I had a 2021 Christian Moreau Chablis Le Clos Grand Cru. I will say, I've always told people that Chablis and sushi would be a good pairing, but we went to an omakase Saturday night with some friends, and I brought that bottle, and it really, really showed well. It was nice and lean and minerally, just a little bit of touch of oak character, but not as much as you get for some of these Grand Cru Chablis these days that are really just trying to be like a Côte d'Or wine. I did have a Village Pouligny Montrachet from Jean Pascal as well, right after the Chablis, and it was really cool just to kind of, I know there's a Village level, but he's a great producer, so it's fun to compare the richness and the style of the Côte d'Or compared to kind of a little bit more of the saline, lean style of the Le Clos Chablis, even though it was a Grand Cru and did see a little bit of time in oak.
The Moreau handled the wasabi paste.
Yeah. The wasabi was not, unfortunately, not real wasabi. It was horseradish, but yeah, balanced through, and it was 10 or 12 little courses, but it went from the sushi, which was fine. There was like a Wagyu meatball in there, which it got the fat perfectly. So it was a nice pairing all the way around. It was great.
Very nice. Yeah, I actually also had a Village Pouligny Montrachet on Easter, but I brought it to the party that we were going to. I had a little bit, and then I don't know where it went or who drank it. So I can't tell you too much about it, but I just remembered that was the other white wine I had this weekend.
Nice. Well, generous gift on your part there. But all right, so we can, on that note, speaking of a couple brands, I guess Pouligny Montrachet in my head is a brand. Every Village is a brand. Well, let's transition to the news for this week. The first one we want to get to is actually what's featured in the Vint Marketplace news a couple weeks back, but Brady just stumbled upon it last week and suggested it to me, clearly showing he doesn't read all the news that I make. But
yeah,
we want to talk about the most admired brands in the wine world. And this is a list put out by the Drinks International. It's a group of 100 independent sommeliers, masters of wines, educator, writers each year, and they vote based on, the parameters are based on the quality and consistency of the wine, the price to quality ratio, and the strength of the branding and marketing. They're asked to list 5 brands, and they give 5 points to their number 1 and go down to 1 point. And basically what they do is they tally up all the scores each year, and then they come out with a list of the top brands. And this year, Catena in Argentina was number 1, Gaia in Italy was number 2, and La Rioja Alta in Rioja was number 3.
Yeah, it's cool that we had 3 friends of the Vint Podcast in the top 11 with Guy Penfolds, aka Treasury Wine Estates, and then Ridge coming in at number 11 and number 1 most admired winery in the United States, which Billy and I might be on the same page about. So cool to see them and Screaming Eagle in the top 50 from the US.
Yeah. And I count La Rioja Alta hasn't come on, but we had a Rioja podcast, so I'll count that as a win as well. So that's cool. And then Henschke, who's our guest today, comes in at number 21 as well. So we got a bunch in there. But it was a really cool list. I think what you could tell is I put my Master of Wine hat on too, because they always talk about what you might get to taste at the Master of Wine exam. And this is really a mix of the top wines in the world, but I think you also got a lot of people really thinking about the strength of brands and the consistency of the wine as it's sold throughout the world. Because you also see in this top 50 Yellowtail and 19 Crimes, which I think both of those you could argue are, especially Yellowtail, are iconic in terms of brands, but also just amazingly consistent in the quality that they put out. It's not like Grand Cru Burgundy or anything, but it's always consistent and achieves the same kind of price to quality ratio there. So I think that's also interesting, the gamut that it runs, because DRC is of course on this list as well. Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about brands that are dominating their segment of the market and who have for so long and are not even just dominating, but who are representative of their space in the market. And yeah, I think it's weird to see Yellowtail coming in above like Chateau Cheval Blanc or Latour, or 19 Crimes coming in right next to Mouton. But yeah, when you look at sort of the wine world holistically, I think you can get a sense and appreciate even those brands that you maybe typically are going to find on the bottom 2 shelves at the grocery store.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's really, really interesting to see the mix, because you also had a ton of wines from Spain, from South America, a lot from New Zealand and Australia is very well represented. So it's definitely in South America, it's definitely a global list. So I think that was really interesting and really interesting for anybody to go look at. It's upcoming. It was featured as our prime story 2 weeks ago in the Mint Marketplace. If you guys want to go check it out, you can click the link there and it'll lead you to the full list. But the other news I wanted to get to today was a follow-up from Jean-Frédéric's interview. He had mentioned in there and wouldn't tell us, which I think he probably could have told us, but who knows, the winner of the Premium Family Vini Prize for 2025. I don't know if you saw who the winner was, Brady. Have you seen it yet?
I did, but it was something I can't pronounce, I believe.
Yeah, and it was, and maybe you are reading the news now. It was in our last week's news. It was a lacquer company, a Japanese lacquer. They make like lacquered barrels. The company was called Tsutsumi Asakichi Urishi. There's 3 names, but they make lacquered barrels in Japan. And the whole point of this award is to go outside of wine and to, again, honor people who are family-run businesses who are making something that is really craft-driven, thoughtful, hands-on pieces of anything. I think he mentioned wool was a great example in our interview as well. So I thought this was a really cool prize. I want one of these barrels now. I'm sure they're not cheap, and I don't know how I can get one, but I'm gonna figure it out.
Yeah, I think if I even knew and could say the name, I don't know if I would have sounded great today. But yeah, it's a pretty cool prize, recognizing, like you said, like authentic, handmade craft, tradition, those kinds of things in family business, which are important for storytelling in the wine world as well.
Yeah, it looks like they just make Japanese lacquer, many things. So it's not just barrels. I saw a picture and it looked like they were just making like buckets or barrels, but I guess they make all sorts of stuff. So definitely go check them out. I want to learn more about this and somehow acquire it. But without more ado here, let's get to our discussion about Henschke, and we'll lead off with the wine that they were so generous to send us a bottle of each. We were lucky enough to get the 2018 Mount Edelston bottle that they sent for each of us ahead of the podcast, and we tasted it over the weekend here, so we were able to talk about it. Before we dive into the actual wine you're tasting notes, Brady, I will note that this bottle, it was special and serendipitous to me because the 2018 vintage was the vintage that I worked in Australia, and when I actually got to visit the Henschke winery. So I was there looking at their barrels and their casks or their fermenters, and this wine possibly was there at the same time I was. And then it came back to me now in bottle form.
Yeah, it was a really great wine for, like I said, one of my few experiences with Australian wines. And in the past, it's always been Syrah as well, or maybe you talk about New Zealand. I've had some wines over there. But yeah, getting to try a wine of this quality, I think reopened my eyes to Syrah from Australia. So yeah, you get that really ripe but zippy and acidic blue fruit, all the spice characteristics that you would expect. But the thing that stood out to me was just how velvety soft it was.
Mm-hmm.
Something I just was not expecting with a wine that has the amount of power and sort of, especially with the spice character, the amount of like intensity on the palate, but still so soft, like velvety tannins, long finish. That's really the thing that stood out to me. If I would make a mark on anything with regard to the tasting notes, just how soft and pretty the wine is.
Yeah, and you were lucky you got to compare it to the Saint Henri, because that's normally a little bit more powerful than this in terms of, I wouldn't say more powerful, but like less finesse and a little bit more concentrated.
Less, maybe just a more masculine version of the wine, like rougher around the edges, not as like silky, and yeah, definitely more abrasive, not in a bad way, but just like more rough and abrasive tannins. Maybe took a little bit to get into itself, whereas the Henschke was, yeah, silky smooth out of the bottle, which was really fun.
Yeah, no, I had the same experience. I think what you could really taste is that freshness that Stephen talks about, being based in the Eden Valley where they are. They're at a higher altitude, so you definitely get a little bit more of that, like I was saying, finesse and acid that you might not get in some riper styles of Shiraz. And like you said, there is incredible depth and complexity of flavor and concentration, with a little bit more maybe elegance than something that's really kind of meaty, like the Saint Henri from Penfolds. It tends to be just so thick and concentrated.
Yeah, you don't feel like with Syrah, both from, you're talking about Syrah, this style where you get a lot of that sort of the spicy intensity or like the chewy nature of the wine. This one, not at all, didn't have that.
Yeah.
It had the palate filling richness, but not the like lingers and cloys at all in its power. So it was cool.
Yeah. Well, I'm really happy you brought that up as well, because we go into that. He talks a little bit about Eden Valley and what makes it special in the 5 winemaker questions, but we go more into the winemaking and their techniques in the interview. And he mentions one of their approaches is this submerged cap. And so it's a very delicate and consistent extraction where they basically just push down the grape skins at the top of the red wines and let them sit in the wine over time, rather than just leaving them exposed to the air and punching them down or just pumping over that way. They submerge the cap and then they will cycle the wine through in a pump over method, but it's a really delicate, consistent way of extraction. And they've been doing it for decades and decades. And I think that is something that is really provides that unique, delicate nature to these Henschke wines, that combined with the exceptional quality of the grapes from these old vines. The vines for this wine are over 100 years old. And what kind of blew my mind, something that he said in the episode, is the vines were planted in 1912 and his relative didn't end up making wine from it. I think it was his father, for the first time until 1952. So like the first time this wine was ever made as a single vineyard wine, the vines were already 40 years old, which is wild to me. Yeah. So it's really exciting. And I think, everybody who maybe had the pleasure of listening to the 5 winemaker questions, it's really interesting to me, the difference here. So we go into so much more depth about what they do in the vineyards, why old vines are special, and how they've worked with their old vineyards and their winemaking. But again, something when you ask them what they're looking forward to, they had a few things that they mentioned in this podcast that they're looking forward to on the roadmap, and then a few different things in the 5 winemaker questions. Again, if you've listened to this and not those, I would definitely go back and listen to both, because they tend to be a good complement to each other.
Yeah, 100%. I would recommend going out and picking up some Henschke wines. It definitely made me want to after trying it. The only thing is, beware, if you want to try and use your Corvin on their wines, you're going to run into a glass stopper. Don't dent your Corvin needles, and take care in pulling the cork out.
Yeah, take your foil off, people. Yeah, I've broken. Yeah. I have, not on their wines, but other glass stoppers, broken Corvin needles, and they talk about that in the podcast as well. They'll be transitioning fully to screw caps in due time here. But for now, these are under glass, and some of the other top cuvées are under glass too. If you are interested in buying more of the Henschke wines, I would check it out at the Vint Marketplace. We have a wide selection of Henschke wines, which are actually harder to find in the US than you would think, along with other top Australian brands. And now, without further ado, here is our full interview with Australian wine legends, Stephen and Prue Henschke. All right, we're here with two very special guests, Stephen and Prue Henschke. I think our listeners will have heard this story probably a couple times now, but I wanted to share with you guys while we were actually on the podcast. So when I was working my vintage in Australia, like I mentioned, I had a very special experience over Easter while I was down there. Since I was by myself and didn't really have any family or people to celebrate with, some of the other cellar hands invited me to join them for their traditional family. They did just like a cookout barbecue in the bush. And in our area, everybody was just wine growers, winemakers, and they all brought in the back of their utes some just like really nice bottles of wine, but in just like coolers, and we were drinking out of plastic like cups. And one of them was just like, "Hey mate, here, have this. Tell your sommelier friends about this." And it was a 1999 Hill of Grace, and that was my very first Henschke wine. And it was so cool because I was in the middle of the bush. Things were like cooking on an open fire, and I just had that. It was a really special experience, and I've loved Henschke wines ever since.
Right, good way to experience it.
It was very authentic. And then 2 weeks later, I made it down and got to visit you guys and some of the vineyards. So that was fantastic. So for those who want to hear a little bit more from you yourselves, can you tell us a little bit more about you guys and then the amazing history of Henschke? It doesn't have to be too long. I know it's really long, but a little bit of background.
Well, I guess it goes back to early settlement days in South Australia, where really hundreds, maybe thousands of families came from Europe. They came from Prussia, an area, German-speaking area of Europe. Under the Prussian king, he was persecuting them for their religion, and they ended up being able to resettle to South Australia. And South Australia was by then a pre-settlement that had been a South Australian company through George Fife Angus, an English Scotsman who was a philanthropist, but also had this vision of his fantastic, wonderful pre-settlement in South Australia. So our families were part of that, and they brought with them a huge number of skills, not just growing as farmers, but there were stonemasons and sculptors and artists and musicians and all sorts of amazing skills. Furniture makers, amazing furniture. And so South Australia had a really rich start, but they also pretty planted vegetable gardens and fruit trees and vineyards and what have you. And their preservation technique was generally fermentation. So fermentation of meats for sausages and fermentation of milk, fermentation of vegetables like sauergurken and sauerkraut and all those sorts of things. What else, right? Gemischte. And then wine was a natural part of that. So making wine wasn't a mystery. It was actually a simple part of their preservation. And I guess enjoyment of life. And because they came from Silesia, there was actually Riesling grown there for centuries. And we don't know whether they brought Riesling with them on the ships out to Australia or whether that material came separately through the James Busby selections and what have you. But at least from the very early days, they were growing Riesling and, interestingly, Shiraz. So Shiraz became very much an Australian selection, and Andrew Kayard has done a lot of work on that. And it seems that Shiraz is popular because it produced good wine and it coped quite well with the climate and the soils. They were the varieties that were really historically in the
Pinot Noir came first.
Oh, Pinot Noir did, but we didn't have it here.
No, it came to Australia first.
It came to Australia, that's interesting. So I guess as the families settled and established, our ancestors settled initially down in the Barossa Valley and then moved up here into the Eden Valley. So the Eden Valley is a high country. It's in the Mount Lofty Ranges. It's a huge mountain range. It actually extends right down into Antarctica when it was all Gondwana land, something like 1 billion years ago. And so we're in a very continental part of South Australia in the mountain range that gives us great day-night temperature differential. And it also keeps the acidity high in the fruit and the purity of fruit there as the fruit ripens. So I guess we celebrated our 150th anniversary in 2018. So we've been making wine now into 6 generations of the Henschke family. There's been a farm and a winery all that time. And we just love the fact that we've got this amazing history and we live in one of the best places in the world and have 2 almost indigenous grape varieties that we grow, which are the Riesling and the Shiraz. And because we don't have phylloxera, those vines that were planted by those original settlers are still living and thriving, and they've got Prue looking after them in our case in that vineyard behind us, the Hill of Grace vineyard.
Yeah, that's a perfect encapsulation. Just quickly there, what do you think prevented the phylloxera from coming? Is it just the composition of the soil where you guys are located, a combination of both? Yeah, I know it's common.
I guess the separation was mainly because of the division of the colonies. So it crept through into Geelong, then into Rutherglen through vine material. And that was into the 1870s. By 1890, there was an act of Parliament to prevent any material coming across the border into South Australia. And I guess most of the transport in those days was by horse. So it was easy to use the border as a delineation between Victoria and South Australia. So that's how it was really prevented. It was purely because transport wasn't as rapid and we were quite separate colonies.
And it was probably the first Phylloxera Act ever declared in the world. So that was to prevent. It was based on the distance of 40 kilometres, which was the distance a horse could travel in a day. So that was sort of the concept of the barrier, the restriction. But Australia's a big country. It's as big as the United States. So between us and where the phylloxera is, it's about 1,000 kilometres. So it is a big distance.
And there is quite a zone of dry land between Victoria and South Australia. So that's that sort of basin that was originally a part of the sea. So it's quite a desert. You'd call it a desert between the two.
So that's helped to restrict it.
Yeah. So there wouldn't be any movement of the actual insect across that landscape.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, I've made that drive a few times, so I know exactly what you're talking about. But I'm glad our listeners can get a sense as well. So when you guys are working with such old vines, can you talk a little bit about maybe a few of your vineyards and the average vine age there? Because I think, especially in the U.S., when people hear old vines, we do have some 100-plus-year-old vines, but not really. People think maybe 30, 50 years. Can you talk a little bit about the consistent old vines you have in some of your vineyards?
Yeah, well, Hill of Grace, I guess, is our oldest patch. So the grandfathers were there when the church was built in 1860. So that's a reference point. Now, 160 years old, 65. So that's one patch. Then there's another block nearby, which was planted in 1910. And then the rest of it was in 1950s.
That was Mount Edelston.
And then Mount Edelston, that's another very old vineyard. That was planted in 1912 in one hit. So that's the oldest part of our sort of vineyard area. And then Eden Valley has another lot of Shiraz that was planted in 1965, 68.
And those vines are over 50 years old now. And they're considered old vines, but they're not the old vines of the early settlement days, which right across the Barossa there actually are still patches of vineyards of different varieties, including Mataro and Grenache and whatever.
Riesling
that are over 100 years old.
Yeah.
So it's quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
And we also, as a Barossa winemakers, about 20 years ago, established an old vine charter, the Barossa Old Vine Charter, which encapsulates Barossa Valley and Eden Valley. And that was And there's actually we've got a booklet with the details in it, and it actually then describes, it guesses about authenticity. We were concerned that people were starting to use this description of old vines, but there was no justification. What is an old vine? So as the Barossa winemakers, we sat down and worked our way through it and came up with the concept that vines over 35 years, so really over a generation, could be called old vine. Vines that are up to, say, 75 years of age.
70 years.
70 years of age could be called
The
survivor vines because they'd survived 2 or 3 generations. Vines, when they got to 100 years of age, obviously they were centenarians. And then when they were over 125 years, like these old grandfather vines at Hill of Grace, they're called then ancestor vines. So we have terminology for the different vine ages. And there's patches of ancestor vines across the Barossa and centenarian vines. And in fact, the Barossa Cellar, which is a building and a vineyard that was established by the barons of the Barossa and the Barossa winemakers sort of group, if you like, is that now there's a heritage planting of all those different selections of the oldest vines in the Barossa in that vineyard. So it's a really cool vineyard, and it's now being called the Ark, if you like, because it's a preservation of some of the oldest vines of the Barossa.
The oldest genetics, yeah.
Wow, that's so cool. And I assume to preserve those genetics, they're planted on their own roots again as well, right?
Oh, yes. They wouldn't be old otherwise.
Well, I mean, like the cuttings that they're making into the new one, yeah.
Well, true, because actually, Bilk has some old vines on rootstock from the 1860s. So I shouldn't discount that. That is actually true. Yeah.
Okay. So for the Ark though, were we talking about Massal selections from old vines that were replanted recently, or are these are just actually a heritage patch still?
These are genetic selections of those oldest vineyards and planted into this new vineyard.
Very cool. Yeah. So, on their own roots. Very cool. Yeah, no, thank you for explaining that, because I think you guys, your area was the first to set out some of these parameters. I think it's been copied or emulated elsewhere, which is very cool. So I wanted to dive in a little bit. I guess this is more Prue's domain. How is taking care of some of these older vines and really caring for them and make, because I guess there's a common misconception, maybe it's not a misconception, but among folks that vines dramatically decrease in viability in terms of commercial viability as they get older, and maybe past 20 years, they'll pull them up. What is the approach to taking care of some of these older vines and making sure that they are healthy and produce their yields each year?
Well, I guess they've always been in a really good patch of soil. So for the grandfathers, we only met them when they were 100 years old. Sort of thing. And so they were surviving through a lot of different seasons of drought and heavy rains. I think the one thing I did, because most of these vineyards were unirrigated, so they were dry grown and they needed some help. As the seasons, especially through the 90s, we saw some drying off then. The rainfall was dipping. And I thought, well, we better put some straw mulch on them. And that's really helped the vines survive through that period. I think they would have survived, but they just were less stressed by putting the mulch underneath the vine. So that was one technique. The other technique, I guess, most important thing is pruning. Now, you can kill a vine by pruning it poorly. And during the 90s, there was a lot of machine pruning happening. And I think that caused the death of a lot of vineyards. A lot of Utipa, which is the dead arm disease. I think that is perhaps the most vital piece, is to actually put your best pruners in there, or prune it yourself. And so there's a technique, it's called self-pruning. Simonette and Serge have really just copied the old basket pruning. So it's just a first bud below, second bud above. It's just a technique to use where you're constantly making small cuts instead of big cuts. And that saves the vine from really being plagued by Oedipal or any other trunk diseases that are flying around in the air. Yeah, breeding's most important.
Awesome. Do you let it do its own thing during the year? Do you guys do any, I guess, mid-season kind of pruning, or do you just kind of like let the canopy grow as it will?
Yeah, because they're growing in fairly vigorous sites, we have had to retrellis, so going away from the old wire, the single wire, and the hanging canopy, we've actually now put them up, and the improvement in the colour and the tannin maturity's been incredible. I think that's been an important change. We do a bit of trimming because they're obviously vigorous and bunch thinning, but that's really dependent on the year. Sometimes we don't need to bunch thin, but other times, yeah.
And these are for some of the younger vines that have been planted maybe in the last 30, 40 years. Not the bush vines, obviously the ones that have been planted in more of the trellis style.
Yeah. Well, I think so. That management is similar to young vines. So we still do a vertical trellis management of the canopy and bunch thinning. But there's something different about the old vines that comes up in the wine, and that's perhaps the texture on the palate.
Right. I actually really wanted to ask you what you guys felt was the perceptual difference. But before we move on to that, I wanted to mention one more time. So on the canopy, I was reading you integrated or incorporated some Scott Henry trellising in some of your vineyards. Can you explain a little bit about what that is and why it helped? I thought that was really interesting that you had done that, and I don't think most of our listeners know what that is.
Yes, well, we tried it on the grandfathers, but the rows are too narrow because in the old days they planted much closer. But Mount Edelston was planted 3.6 meters apart and in the row, so it's quite a widespread planting distance. And so we did some trials on different trellis arrangements. We did double wire, vertical shoot positioning. We did Geneva double curtain. What else? We used Scott Henry, and we used a single VSP. What came out best was the Scott Henry, and I think for the same reasons, that beautiful build up in colour, the aeration of the canopy, which was really important in a vigorous site like Mount Edelston, and then the tannin maturity. And I think as you go from the 80s into the 90s of those vintages, you can see that difference in the bottle.
And it seems to be explained by the increased foliage that's exposed to light. So your leaves are your factories for colour, flavour, texture, tannin maturity and everything else. So if you take your leaves away, then you can't ripen your grapes. So the more leaves that you can expose to light, not to sun burn, but to light, the better. So our vineyards tend to run east-west, and then the sun goes over the top of the vine row, and you don't get direct sunlight against the fruit, the exposed fruit. And that's really important for colour development and flavour. So yeah, the more light, really the better. It's called sunlight into wine.
Super. All right. So I think now is a perfect time to transition into the wines themselves. Can you just talk a little bit about, I guess, not all of the bottlings you do, because you have a number, but maybe some of the most well-known bottlings and kind of what differentiates them from your point of view, and then we'll talk about the old vine influence on the palate as well.
Well, we have 3 significant single vineyards that provide us with our unique single vineyard wines. Probably the first one I should mention is the Mount Edelston, because the Mount Edelston was my father's first single vineyard wine that he bottled in 1952. So this was a vineyard from the Angus planting that was planted in 1912 by Ronald Angus. And so the vines are already 40 years old when my father bottled the first single vineyard wine from that. The fruit was offered to him by a neighbour, Colin Angus. And by 1956, that wine was so well regarded in Australia, it was winning prizes in the wine shows, that he was inspired then to bottle the vineyard, the wine from the vineyard, which is this one, at the Hill of Grace Vineyard in 1958. So that then, although that was his second wine as a single vineyard wine that he bottled, those vines were actually already 100 years old. There would be no other wine in the world that has first bottling from 100-year-old vines, and now we're produced it for another 50, 55 years or so. So it's actually a very unique old vineyard. So there we have, if you like, ancestor vines, centenary vines with Mount Eddleton. And then in mid-1960s, Cyril, my father, then planted the vineyard down in the Eden Valley, so close to the village of Eden Valley, up on the range, which was actually an old dairy property, and he planted Riesling, Shiraz, Semillon, and some Cabernet. And that Shiraz we call the Wheelwright Vineyard, and that Wheelwright Vineyard, because my ancestor, actually is on his shipping documents, he was a wheelwright and a stonemason, so we thought the Wheelwright name was really cool, and for a sort of historical name. So we called that the Wheelwright Vineyard. Those vines are over 50 years old. So we have a 50-year-old vineyard, a 100-year-old vineyard, and a 150-year-old vineyard, all on their original vine roots. They're ungrafted, and Prue is their lucky champion who looks after them.
Very nice. Have you seen, I guess sorry to go back to the vineyard, it's where my passion always lies in the vineyard. Have you seen the any disease or pests or anything fluctuate, like different issues over the years? Like what has been the biggest threat to some of these aside from like Utipa or Utipa?
Yeah, well, Utipa is the big one, and that's really what we have to try and prune away from. And we did a mass selection program on Mount Eddleston and Hill of Grace in 1986. And this actually gave us material to assess. And then from that assessment, we planted a source block at Mount Eddleston, which we'll use for replanting. But we've got to be careful because an old block can only have 35% young material in it. So it's a gradual process. We're also doing a bit of layering as well to take up the space left by a dead vine. They do eventually die, but it's more to do with the entry of Utipa, and that would be the most insidious disease. The other fungal diseases, they come and go. 2011, we had a huge rainfall. It's double the rainfall, and we couldn't avoid downy mildew. That's a very seasonal thing. And can lose a whole year's work in a couple of weeks. But other than that, powdery mildew is very controllable. There are three main issues.
Do you see the old vines stand up to anything? Or I guess aside from like drought, which old vines tend to handle very well, do you see old vines handling other things better than younger vines, or about the same?
Well, I guess they've got a lot more live material to handle Utipa. So what you can often do is redevelop the crown. So you can go away from the part that was dying away, and then you can start building up on the other side of the vine that's not as affected. It will eventually be affected, but then you can start the vine over again, and that's almost impossible with a young vine.
Yeah.
And that's because I was going to say that's because Utipa's it's because of the sap flow issue, right? That's eventually how it kills it, and so if you keep it flowing elsewhere, it'll avoid that roadblock.
Exactly. Yeah. But preservation of sap flow.
Yeah. And I was going to say, and with the old vines, they generally tend to have a bigger root mass, a bigger root ball, greater carbohydrate storage in the trunk, and they generally their roots tend to go down deeper. And as dry grown old vines, they tend to be well established, so they have that greater resilience. But it still requires having a good viticulturist who looks after them well. And I think one thing that Prue has done uniquely, I think, in our region is to use compost and straw mulch and then plant native grasses and native flowering plants so that you're not competing so much with the vine. You're actually allowing the vine to be a part of the natural landscape. And that's really important.
Yep. Yeah, very, Very nice. I noticed when I visited years ago, Hill of Grace looked very lush. It felt less industrial than a lot of the other vineyards that I had been around. So that was very cool to see.
It's totally industrial.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Cool. Can we talk a little bit about the winemaking and then maybe the differences that maybe wine drinkers can expect from each of the different single vineyards and maybe your Riesling as well? But how do you guys go about producing in the winery these grapes or these wines?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think for us, it's about preserving the unique flavors of those different vineyards, those different soils, those different vine ages. And so the technique that we use at the winery is actually a well-tried and tested technique, and we've been using it for about 150 years, so it's not broken. And that's really just a traditional submerged cap fermentation. So a submerged cap fermentation really means that when the fruit comes in, we do all the selection, obviously, process to make sure we've got good, clean, healthy fruit going into the fermentation. We really just do a berry shake off with the vines now. We don't crush the grapes so much anymore. And they go into the fermentation tank. We then and these tanks are old concrete tanks that were built back in the 1950s, the ones that we're currently using. We wax line them, so we use a paraffin wax lining so that the wine doesn't come in contact with the raw cement, in this case old cement. And so then it's in a neutral container. It has quite interesting thermodynamics because of the structure of these sort of banks of tanks that we ferment in. We put wooden boards, so waxed wooden boards over the top that hold down the skins underneath the juice during fermentation. There's a chimney as well put in that allows access to the bottom of the fermentation tank for pumping over, for doing rack and returns, for cooling and things like that. But it's just a very natural, it's basically like a big pot in the kitchen that you just hold your skins or your fruit in underneath the juice. But it ferments gently like that for 7 to 10 days. We extend the fermentation by cooling it, so we end up with a nice gentle fermentation curve. And at the end, we're tasting all the time to make sure that we're happy with the flavor, the tannin extraction, the velvety. And I think the one positive about Shiraz variety that we have here is that Shiraz has really bright fragrance and lovely spicy flavors and dark berry fruit flavors, but also has very velvety tannins. So that tannin maturity, we're tasting in the vineyard before we're picking, we're making decisions on that velvety tannin. And you can taste that same tannin in the bottle of wine when you drink it 5-10 years later. So it's exactly the same velvety sensation, and it's protected by that gentle fermentation technique. Then it goes off to barrels. We don't use a lot of new oak because we want the wine to show the vineyard flavors, not an oak forest. And then after about 2 years, it's bottled, goes into our cellar for a couple of years to mature in bottle before it's released for people to see what the new vintage is like.
Awesome. So when you guys are pumping over or doing rack and return, is that, you said, just for cooling purposes? Since the cap is submerged, there's no need to wet it over again.
No, the only thing is distribution of the juice within the fermenter, because if you have a 5-ton fermenter, then you want that juice to mix right around through the cap. So we pump it over twice a day, and then we make our decisions on cooling depending on what the fermentation activity is doing. So sometimes it might be just pumped over, sometimes it might be pumped over through the heat exchanger to cool it and back in again. And then generally twice during its fermentation, over that 7 to 10 days, we'll run the juice up into another tank, basically drain it right out of the cap, and then put it back in again and reset the cap. The head.
Very cool. Very nice. All right. Well, now looking at the individual wines, since they're all fermented in about the same way, I know they taste dramatically different based on what I've tasted. And so can we talk maybe a little bit about the unique flavor profiles we'll go with the single vineyards and the Riesling, and then I also want to ask about Johann's Garden because I still have the 2015 that I brought back when I visited you guys in my fridge now too.
Do you want to talk about the influence of the soil on the wine, say in the Eden Valley vineyard?
Yes, well, that's quite interesting. I think since we've brought out the wheelwright Shiraz, we found that there's a difference in the flavour profiles. We always knew that there was a strong difference between Mount Edison and Hill of Grace, but to see the wheelwright actually differ too really reinforces the role of the soil type. So it's not so much that it's the soil feeding the flavour, but it's most probably something to do with the hydrology or the structure or something like that. But so Hill of Grace is on this beautiful old red-brown earth with the silty limes and things like that. And it has this beautiful spice character. You move to Mount Edelston, the vines are more vigorous, and you get this amazing bay leaf and sage character that shows up. And I'm thinking perhaps it's because of the vigor of the vine. And then you go to Eden Valley, and there's a real difference here. You're going from the beautiful red-brown earths or the clays and on an alkaline sort of bedrock, and then you're moving into a sandstone and a sandy lime, which is quite acidic. So suddenly the wines change into this beautiful, bright, red-fruited style of Shiraz. Very different.
Very cool.
I don't know how to explain it other than with different soils.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then you were talking about the texture and some of the nuance that comes from the old vines. Can you just describe that a little bit? I think many people still debate whether or not old vines give distinct fruit. I've always been in the camp that they certainly do. So I'd love to hear your take as well.
Well, as part of the mass selection we did off the grandfather at the Hill of Grace, Uncle Lou and I were a bit impatient, so we planted our selection 3 years later. So we took the cuttings, got them propagated, and they went into a special plot called Hill of Roses. And as Hill of Roses started to be bottled separately, we could really see the difference between the wine off a young lot compared to the grandfathers. And it was all up front, and really the tannins were quite not chunky, but more
grippy,
yeah. And so there was this real difference in the maturity figures too. From a winemaker's perspective, that there was a little bit of imbalance between the pH and the...
Chimney, they had higher pHs and lower acidities than the old grandfather vines.
And the old vines have this tendency to remain at that constant pH and lovely high acidity. And I guess in the glass, now we're seeing Hill of Roses at 35 years old, 32 years old, 32. So now an old vine, but there's still a slight difference in the tannins. And you can see this sort of real complexity in the mouthfeel, and the tannins are a lot smoother and longer compared to the younger wine. So, yeah, it takes being able to compare them in the bottle side by side to understand the role of the old vine.
So there is a difference. And it's a discernible difference. And it's been interesting because since 2001, we bottled the Hill of Roses as a separate wine. And every year now, since 2001, now over 20 years, we've been following the two wines to see whether they're converging in terms of complexity and quality. And we are seeing a trend for those younger vines to become more complex, to become more velvety in their tannin structure and more vibrant in their spice character. And it's interesting how they're coming together. They haven't come together enough yet that we could consider to include them in the Hill of Grace. But one day that's maybe a decision that will be made, hopefully by the next generation, not by us. But we'll see.
That you made me think of another interesting point. Is there a point at which the old vines are just like always producing the same character? Will a 70-year-old vine taste similar to a 100 year old vine? I know you guys you're not bottling these differently, but are you micro vinifying and seeing them along the way?
I think that's most probably right. We're hoping that that's right.
So they've got like they peak.
Yeah. Because we've got the younger blocks in Hill of Grace are 70. Yeah, they've just hit 73 years old, and they are in Hill of Grace.
And they're amazing because they respond. The vineyard is only a few hectares, but they're along the creek line, so there's really 4 components to the vineyard, if you like. And they're all slightly different, but are they slightly different because of the vine age, or are they slightly different because of the soil variation, to the hydrology? There's a whole range of factors that take place, even in a small vineyard like the Hill of Grace vineyard. So it's an interesting phenomenon. We actually did a tasting with a group of journalists probably about 10 years ago, where we sat in the vineyard and we had wines from the fermenters of that current vintage in front of them. We had grapes that we picked from the different, so now those berries from the different blocks in front of them that we kept in the cool room. Then we had wine from the previous vintage from barrel as a comparison. So we could actually sit there and say, from over there, that's what it tastes like. From over there, that's what it tastes like. And they just loved it. They thought it was amazing. Yeah. We see it each year, but for people who haven't experienced that, it was actually quite unique. And these are all vines that have been planted by ancestors, no, not by us. And so it's really quite a joy for us as well to experience that sort of thing. So it was great. It was great. Project we did.
Yeah, wow, that sounds amazing. That's like a wine nerd like me's dream. So I can see why they enjoyed it. Well, great. We're getting closer to time here. Can you guys briefly talk a little bit about your Riesling as well? I don't want to let that go without its due.
The Riesling's always been there. I guess as some of the older blocks are planted with a really early introduction of Riesling into Australia. And and then I guess we spent 2 years in Geisenheim in Germany, and I became familiar with all the different clones that they were releasing in those days. And so we actually managed to get those clones and plant them into the vineyard. So that's been really a progression to really expand the Riesling flavor profile, is to use the new clones from home. And it's been a lot of fun because you can see some of that lovely floral lift in the newer clones.
I mean, we're also quite focused on good canopy management with Riesling as well, because Riesling, you don't want a full exposure to sunlight. You actually want a little bit of dappled light. So we use a vertical position canopy somewhat with it, so we keep
a loose canopy, floppy.
And that's really important because the previous generations believed that Riesling they had in their minds the Mosel.
Oh, and the hop.
In a way, the hop region, so. But they had visions that the vines had to grow in rocky soil and really had to fight to produce good flavor. And we found this actually slightly the reverse. We're looking for vines that have really, really airy, really nice soil so that they build beautiful aromatic flavors. And we're looking, in terms of tasting, we're looking at a flavor profile where they turn from herbaceous flavors into that lime, zesty, pretty floral, almost frangipani sort of flavors on the palate. But above that, then you start getting honey. So we're picking generally at about between 11% and 12% alcohol. And above that, we find we start to lose all that beautiful delicacy and florals and fragrance. And wines, once Riesling is at 13% or so, then it becomes too ripe, slightly too alcoholic, and you don't get that beautiful purity of zestiness that you want in Riesling and freshness. We also keep our Riesling dry, so our Riesling would have a maximum of 3 or 4 grams of residual sugar, because we want that beautiful zestiness and crispness of the Riesling as a focus for matching with food. And we eat a lot of seafood in South Australia. King George whiting is one of the most beautiful fish. And that's just an absolute match made in heaven with Riesling. You want your Riesling to be really food friendly and just delicious to drink.
Yeah, that makes sense. How would you compare, for those who might be familiar with like Clare Valley Riesling, how would Eden Valley and your in particular Riesling differ?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's really just a slight difference in flavor profile. It's interesting that Clare Valley is in the same, it's called a valley, but it's because it's a valley within the range, but it's within the same mountain range, the same Mount Lofty mountain range, but it's about 100 kilometers further north from where we are. So they picked their Riesling about 2 weeks earlier than us. So what happens in Eden Valley, where because we're picking a couple of weeks later, we tend to be picking a slightly cooler period of the season. So we tend to have a longer ripening period with our Riesling. And I think we're getting more nuanced, supple florals, zesty and pretty florals, flower garden sort of florals in our Riesling. But
Clare has a little bit of still a citrus, but a slight touch of mandarin in the flavor profile. That's the only way I can pick it.
And they're sufficiently different enough to be able to see the difference, but they're both regions produce beautiful Riesling.
Yeah.
And I think they're becoming quite well recognized around the world as some of the most beautiful Rieslings on the planet.
Definitely. Do they ripen later further north because they're further from the ocean? No, wait. They ripen earlier, 2 weeks earlier. Is that because it's warmer up there and it's because they're further from the ocean influence where you guys are? Okay.
Yeah.
Correct.
Interesting. I didn't think about that as I was driving. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, great. Well, so just to wrap up here, are you guys working on any new bottlings? Is there anything new coming down the line, or are you really excited about your new releases? I've heard the 2021 single vineyard wines are going to be amazing.
Well, we've been playing around with Gruneveltliner at Lenswood, so that's really going to be fun. I just tasted it yesterday in the firm. Oh, God, it's gorgeous. And then I've been playing around with the Rhone varieties. We've planted a whole lot of the C's, the Counoise, Carignan, Cinsault, Clairette, Grenache Gris. So we're doing a sequential ferment with Grenache. And that's looking pretty exciting. Mainly because the Counoise brings in this high acid pepper character into the wine. And it really balances well with the Grenache. So that's a fun little thing.
Prue is also planted back in the early 2000s some Nebbiolo and Tempranillo. So they're two other varieties that we're working with, and they're great fun.
Yeah.
Tempranillo has responded really well to the Eden Valley climate.
Yeah, we're lucky with that.
And because we have a connection with our son living in Madrid at the moment, or Miranda, it's nice to have that sort of connection with Spain with that variety. But the Nebbiolo is also a really interesting variety. We like that amazing sort of rose hip sabriness that you get with Nebbiolo. And we're doing a longer maturazione, so a long time on skins, about 6 months on skin for the tannins to resolve. It's really interesting following the tannins profile as you go over that long period and seeing how they resolve themselves and they build and then they dissipate and they build, and it's fascinating. But it's a really beautiful, beautiful food variety.
Wow. For that one, do you submerge the cap too, or do you use a different management technique for?
We do basically like a crushed fermentation, but we don't submerge the cap. We irrigate the cap. We keep it covered. And then for the extended maceration, we do submerge it. We then put a cap on, head on top of that, hold it submerged, almost a bit like a tea bag in a way, in the wine while it's under inert gas, then for that long period of time.
Very good.
It's a fun thing to do, and it's something, as a winemaker, people think, well, surely there's nothing else you can do that's different. Every now and again you come across another idea, and think, well, why not try it just to see what the effect is? And sometimes the effect can be amazing. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. So it's good fun.
Awesome. Well, we'll keep an eye out for those bottles along with your single vineyard stuff. But thank you so much for joining today. This has been great.
They're tiny amounts, so you have to come here and taste them.
You don't have to twist my arm. Well, thank you so much, guys. This has been great.
Pleasure. All the best.
All right. That was our interview with Stephen and Prue Henschke. If you enjoyed that interview and want to learn more and haven't listened yet, go check out our 5 Questions with a Winemaker episode with them and go to the Vint Marketplace to find some Henschke wines to add to your cellar. But for now, that is our episode for this week, and we'll be back with another 5 Questions with a Winemaker on Friday and a full episode next week. Cheers.